Hannah prayed for a son so desperately that a priest accused her of being drunk. God gave her exactly what she asked for, and the first thing she did with that answered prayer was give it away forever, while the boy was still small enough to hold in her arms. Most people know Samuel as the boy who heard God calling his name in the middle of the night at the tabernacle. Almost no one talks about his mother, or what it actually cost her to put him there in the first place, or what it took for her to walk out of that sacred building without the only thing she had ever wanted. Elkanah had 2 wives. Peninnah had children, several of them, sons and daughters both, a house that never went quiet, always some small voice calling for her attention. Hannah had none, and in a culture where a woman's worth was measured almost entirely by the sons she produced, that single fact defined every year of Hannah's life, coloring how she was seen by her household, her community, and, very likely, herself, in the quiet hours when no one else was watching her face. Scripture doesn't soften what Peninnah did with that advantage. Year after year, whenever the family made their annual pilgrimage to worship and sacrifice at Shiloh, Peninnah provoked Hannah bitterly, needling her about her empty womb until Hannah wept and could not eat, the taunting apparently sharpest during the very season meant to be sacred, as though even worship itself had become another arena for Hannah's humiliation, a yearly reminder dressed up as devotion. Elkanah, for his part, loved Hannah deeply. The text tells us that at the sacrificial meal he gave portions to Peninnah and all her children, but to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. He once asked her, with the kind of tenderness that still couldn't fully reach the wound, "Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons?" It is a striking question, one many husbands across many centuries have asked in one form or another, believing love alone should be sufficient answer to grief. But love from a husband, however genuine, did not erase the ache of empty arms or the sting of watching another woman's children run through the same household Hannah lived in every single day, a constant walking reminder of exactly what she lacked, no matter how kindly Elkanah meant his question. This went on for years, not one difficult season, but a repeating cycle, the same humiliation returning every single time the family traveled to worship, as though even the most sacred moments of Hannah's calendar came preloaded with pain she couldn't escape by staying home either, since staying home meant enduring Peninnah's household every single day instead of only during the pilgrimage. There was no version of that year which did not include this particular grief somewhere inside it, and here is where the story usually accelerates, too quickly toward the miracle, skipping past just how raw Hannah's despair had actually become by the time she finally broke, as though her years of quiet suffering were merely a brief prelude rather than the larger portion of her story. On one particular visit to Shiloh, after the family had eaten and drunk at the sacrificial meal, Hannah rose and went to the tabernacle alone, in bitterness of soul, and wept in anguish as she prayed, her whole body likely shaking with the weight of years, finally reaching some kind of breaking point that no amount of double portions or gentle questions from her husband had ever managed to touch. She made a vow that Scripture records in startling detail. "O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head." This was not a passing wish whispered in a moment of hope. This was a woman, worn down by years of grief and public shame, offering the one thing she wanted more than anything else in the world back to God before she had even received it, promising in advance to give away the very prayer she was praying, if only it would be answered, as though she understood instinctively that the deepest longing of her life could only be honored by being surrendered completely, not kept and guarded and hoarded the way most people would want to keep. An answered prayer. She prayed so long and so silently, her lips moving but no sound coming out, her whole posture unlike anything the priest was used to seeing at that hour, in that place, that Eli the priest, watching from his seat beside the doorpost of the temple, assumed she was drunk. "How long will you go on being drunk?" he demanded. "Put your wine away from you." Consider the layered cruelty of that moment. A woman already broken by years of shame, pouring out the deepest anguish of her life in complete silence before God. In the one place, she might have hoped to finally be understood without needing to explain herself, mistaken by the one person in that sacred space who should have recognized real grief when he saw it, whose entire vocation was supposed to be discerning the difference between sin and sorrow. Hannah answered him plainly, without anger, though surely with exhaustion visible in every syllable. "No, my lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have not been drinking wine or strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation." Eli's tone shifted immediately, whatever suspicion he'd carried dissolving in the face of her plain honesty. "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition." Hannah returned to her family, and Scripture tells us something quietly remarkable. She ate, and her face was no longer sad. Nothing about her circumstances had actually changed yet. She still had no son. The years of Peninnah's provocation had not been undone, but something about finally speaking her grief aloud and finally being heard, even by a priest who had first misjudged her, had already begun to lift the weight she'd been carrying alone for so long, before a single physical thing about her life had actually changed. In time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, explaining that she had asked him of the Lord, his very name a permanent record of the prayer that had produced him, spoken aloud every single time anyone in the household called for him across the years that followed, a name that turned an ordinary child into a living testimony every time it was used. This is where almost every retelling either rushes forward to the famous night at the tabernacle when God calls the boy's name in the dark, or stops entirely, satisfied with a tidy, happy ending. Barren woman. Praise, barren woman receives son. Story complete. Credits roll. But the vow Hannah made in her anguish was not a metaphor, and it was not made lightly, and it was not forgotten the moment the child in her arms made the pain of the past feel worth it. She had promised to give this child back, entirely, for the whole of his life, and unlike promises made in desperate moments that often soften once the crisis has passed, once the thing prayed for is finally, gloriously in hand, and the temptation to quietly renegotiate becomes overwhelming, Hannah kept hers with a specificity that should stop anyone who has ever loved a small child in their tracks. When Elkanah made the next pilgrimage to Shiloh, Hannah did not go, telling him plainly, "As soon as the child is weaned, I will bring him, so that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and dwell there forever." In that era, weaning often didn't happen until a child was 2 or 3 years old, meaning Hannah kept her son for only a few, short years total, knowing the entire time, every single day, exactly how those years would end, with no illusion that time would somehow soften the arrangement or that circumstances might change the plan. Try to imagine those years as Hannah actually lived them. Every first word Samuel spoke, she alone was there to hear, knowing she would not be there for the ones that came after. Every small milestone, his first steps, his first attempts to help around the house, the particular way he laughed, the specific shape of his small hand reaching for hers, arrived already wrapped in the knowledge of an ending she herself had chosen, back when she had nothing left to lose and everything left to want. Most mothers raise children hoping for as many years together as possible, treasuring the uncertainty of how much time they'll get. Hannah counted down, on purpose, toward a departure she had promised with her own mouth before her son ever existed, living inside a countdown of her own, making every ordinary day quietly numbered. When the child was weaned, Hannah took him up to Shiloh herself, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, the offerings due for the vow she was about to complete, carried on the same road she had once walked home from years earlier with empty arms and a broken face, a road that now carried entirely different weight beneath her feet. After the bull was sacrificed, she brought the boy to Eli, the very priest who had once mistaken her grief for drunkenness, and said words that Scripture preserves with striking directness, "O my Lord," As you live, my Lord, I am the woman who was standing here in your presence, praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord." There is something almost unbearable in the fact that Hannah began that sentence by reminding Eli who she was, the same woman he had rebuked, now standing in the same spot, holding the living proof that her silent, desperate prayer had actually been heard, closing a circle that had opened years earlier in that very doorway. And then, Scripture says simply, she left him there. 4 words that compress an entire lifetime of longing into a single sentence, and an entire mother's heartbreak into a moment the text refuses to dwell on any longer than that. No description of tears, no lingering embrace, recorded in detail, no final look back through the doorway, no account of how Samuel reacted to being left among strangers in an unfamiliar place. Just a woman who had waited years for a son, walking out of the tabernacle without him, keeping a promise made in a season of total despair, now that despair had been fully and completely answered. Before she left, though, Scripture preserves something else almost never narrated with any weight, a prayer of praise Hannah offered right there at Shiloh, a song that would echo for centuries afterward in the words of another young mother, Mary, who would one day sing something remarkably similar over her own unexpected son. Hannah's prayer begins with pure exultation. "My heart exults in the Lord. My strength is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation." But it moves quickly beyond her own personal joy into something far larger, a vision of a God who overturns the entire order of the world, who brings low and who exalts, who raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap, who makes barren women the mothers of many children, while the once fertile grow weak. It is worth pausing on the fact that a woman, standing at the exact threshold of the hardest sacrifice of her life, did not sing a private lament about her own loss. She sang about a God whose justice reaches every corner of creation, as though her own story had become, in that moment, proof of something true about the whole world and not merely about her. What did not end was Hannah's love, or her presence in whatever small way remained possible after that morning. Every year, when the family made their pilgrimage to Shiloh for the annual sacrifice, Hannah brought Samuel a little robe that she had made for him herself, a small act of ongoing motherhood, stitched by hand across the miles and the months between visits, the only tangible thread connecting a mother to a son she had given away on purpose. Imagine the discipline behind that yearly robe, measuring the growth of a child she wasn't there to watch grow, guessing at how much taller he'd gotten since the last visit, choosing the fabric, working the seams by lamplight in a house that was quieter now than it used to be, sewing love into cloth because it was the only form her love was still allowed to take for 11 months out of every 12. There is no record of what those visits themselves were like, whether Samuel ran to her, whether there was an awkwardness that time and distance inevitably build between a mother and a child raised by others, whether Hannah lingered as long as she was permitted before turning to make the journey home without him yet again. And Scripture makes clear that Hannah's sacrifice was not met with silence from God. Eli blessed Elkanah and Hannah each year, praying that the Lord would give them more children in place of the one Hannah had lent to him. And the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and bore 3 more sons and 2 daughters. The woman who had once sat weeping and unable to eat at that same sacrificial table was given a full household after all, even as the very first answer to her prayer continued growing up in the tabernacle a short journey away, learning to minister before the Lord, wearing a robe stitched every year by the mother who had given him away without ever fully letting him go. It is worth noticing that God's blessing did not arrive as a replacement for Samuel, or an attempt to soften the sacrifice by distracting her from it. It arrived after the sacrifice was already complete, as though heaven itself wanted to make clear that surrender, freely given, was never punished with emptiness. Meanwhile, in the very house where Samuel was growing up, a different story was unfolding, one that made Hannah's decision look wiser with every passing year. Eli's own 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests themselves, and Scripture describes them in language that leaves nothing to the imagination. Worthless men who did not know the Lord. They took for themselves the choicest parts of the sacrifices brought by ordinary worshippers, seizing meat before it had even been properly offered to God, treating the sacred rituals of Israel's worship as nothing more than a source of personal appetite. Their corruption was not a private failing kept quiet within the walls of the tabernacle. It was public knowledge, so well known that the text tells us, people began to treat the offerings of the Lord with contempt because of what Hophni and Phinehas were doing with them, an entire nation's reverence for worship eroded by two men who should have modeled it. Eli knew what his sons were doing. He rebuked them, mildly, with words that carried no real authority behind them, and did nothing to actually stop it. Against that backdrop of decay, Samuel grew up as the quiet counterweight nobody had planned for. Scripture tells us plainly that he grew in stature and in favor with the Lord and with man, ministering before the Lord as a boy wearing a linen ephod, faithful in a place where faithfulness was rapidly becoming the exception rather than the rule. It is a striking picture to hold in mind. The son of the woman who kept her word precisely, growing up inside a religious system being slowly hollowed out by the sons of the man who had once misjudged her for drunkenness, and who was now failing to correct his own children in exactly the way. Hannah had never failed to keep her own promise. The night everyone remembers came later, when Samuel was still young enough to be sleeping near the ark of God, and a voice called his name in the darkness. He assumed it was Eli, and ran to him 3 times before the old priest finally understood what was happening and instructed the boy how to answer if the voice called again. "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." What God told Samuel that night was not gentle news. It was judgment against Eli's entire household, a prophecy that Hophni and Phinehas would both die on the same day, that the corruption Eli had tolerated for years was about to be answered in full, that the priestly line itself would be judged for a father's failure to restrain what he knew was wrong. Samuel, still a boy, had to deliver that message to the man who had raised him inside the tabernacle, the same man his own mother had once stood before as a woman troubled in spirit, now receiving the hardest news any priest in Israel had heard in a generation from a child too young to soften it. Everything Samuel told Eli came true. Hophni and Phinehas died on the same day, in battle against the Philistines, the very day the Ark of God itself was captured by an enemy army. A catastrophe so total that when Eli heard the news, he fell backward from his seat and broke his neck, dying at 98 years old, having judged Israel for 40 years and having failed in the end to judge his own household with the same seriousness. Out of that collapse, Samuel rose as exactly what the book of Judges had been waiting for across generations of chaos and moral failure. The last of the judges of Israel, a prophet whose words never fell to the ground, the man history would remember as the one who anointed both of Israel's first 2 kings, Saul and then David, shaping the entire future of the nation with his own hands. None of it, not the judgeship, not the prophecies, not the kings he would one day anoint, would have happened without a woman's private anguish in a doorway, mistaken for drunkenness, answered with a son, and then given back exactly as promised, one small robe at a time, year after year, for the rest of her life. Hannah did not live to see everything her sacrifice would become. She could not have known, standing in that doorway with empty arms after leaving her small son behind, that the boy she'd given away would go on to anoint the very king who would one day be called a man after God's own heart, or that her own decision to keep a desperate promise would ripple outward for generations into the history of an entire nation. It's easy, from a distance of thousands of years, to see Hannah's story as a triumph with a tidy shape: barrenness, prayer, birth, dedication, blessing. But sitting inside the actual texture of her life, the shape looks very different. It looks like years of humiliation absorbed quietly at a family table, a prayer so raw it was mistaken for drunkenness, a vow made with nothing left to lose, and then, after everything she had wanted finally arrived, the deliberate, repeated discipline of letting it go exactly as she'd promised, stitching a robe every year as the only proof that love, even given away, does not actually disappear. Hannah didn't just pray for a miracle. She let the miracle go, on purpose, the exact moment she'd promised she would, when nobody would have blamed her for quietly forgetting a vow made in her lowest hour. That kind of surrender doesn't get talked about nearly as much as the prayer that came before it, but it might be the harder, more remarkable part of her story. Loving someone enough to keep a promise that costs you everything you asked for, and trusting that love finds a way to survive the distance anyway. If you want the parts of these stories other channels never slow down enough to tell, subscribe to Untold Bible Stories, a new story like this one every week. And next time, we're staying with the servant girl who spoke one sentence to a foreign general's wife, long before anyone remembered her name.